Welcome to a Mackenzie Institute Long Talk. Lawrence Foster is a policeman in Manchester, England. One of his toughest jobs has been security at Old Trafford, the home of one of the most celebrated sporting teams in the world, the Manchester United Soccer Football Club. Week after week, he was responsible for keeping 67,000 fans safe in one of the great cauldrons of sports, a European soccer match. Lawrence helped plan the European Football Championships when Britain hosted the competition. From soccer football games to rock concerts, he had 250,000 visitors to keep safe. He knows, inside out, every aspect of crowd control. I met Lawrence Foster when we were studying at Leicester University, north of London. We both graduated with master's degrees in risk, crisis, and disaster management. His final thesis focused on stadium safety, a subject that produces more questions than answers. A lot of policing involves avoiding or controlling crowds, yet stadia, by definition, create crowds. So I began with, how does that change the police role?
It becomes necessary to realise that when we have stadia that attract such large crowds, that a specialist type of handling is required to make sure those crowds are managed correctly. Historically, police have had involvement in large stadia. They've had a great long-term and an intricate role in the management of stadium. This doesn't necessarily that they're the best people to do it, because they are not ultimately trained in crowd management. They're trained in crime techniques and other matters, and as you say, to reduce, fragment a crowd. There is therefore a need for people to be trained to deal with crowds at the stadium. It needs to be by the management of the stadium, by the owners of the stadium, that they are responsible for the dealing of crowds. It isn't necessarily a police problem. There's a need for the people responsible for stadia to recognise the psychology and dynamics of a crowd.
Are crowds always bad?
Crowds aren't always bad. Crowds are, in the main, fortunately, when we consider the size of the stadia that we have within the North American continent and within the UK, fortunately, crowds in the main are very good. But it's very easy for a crowd to turn. I say, if that crowd isn't handled correctly, there is this possible ripple effect out from the centre of an area where frustration is allowed to develop, to incubate. If we have a situation where somebody may be ill, somebody may be drunk, violent, or drugs, and they may be within one centre of a crowd. And if there's too much emphasis given to the safety of that stadium and not the training to the people who work within that stadium, then that one little problem can be allowed to escalate and grow and develop around the people around it, who become frustrated with what's occurring near them, that somebody's near them who is not well, or who is violent, or who is drugged, or whatever, and the people in the area aren't taking responsibility for it. Unfortunately, there is an element within stadium management, I would say, from my knowledge, within the North American and the European and the United Kingdom areas, of too much reliance on the structure of the stadium. Over a 100-year period, there have been about 50 disasters in the UK, 50 stadium-based disasters in the UK. However, only a small percentage of those can be attributed to violence, to hooliganism. The remaining, I'd say, over 80% of those disasters are a result of structural failure. Now, in the UK also we have older stadia, but this is where we are now learning. We've had this very sharp learning curve that we cannot rely on structure.
So when we hear of people being injured at a football match in the UK, 50% of the time that's a turnstile or a door or something?
Oh, more than 50%. More than 50%. It's been a barrier failure, a design failure. Design is one of the greater failures, where people are allowed to flow down large concourse areas and through certain turnstile areas into an area like at Hillsborough. They were allowed to flow into an area unchecked, and they were allowed to go in. The majority of an element of the crowd were allowed to go right behind the goal at one end of the ground, which resulted in a great deal of crushing. If the design had been different, then they may have been funnelled elsewhere. However, there was an assumption by the authorities involved that the design of the stadium would have prevented this type of disaster.
What do we do for police officers and for stadium managers who are managing crowds?
Right. There is a great need for stadium managers to recognise the psychology of crowds, the dynamic properties of crowds, and not assume that the structure that they work within is going to hold them safely. There is a need for, which has commenced within the UK, and it's something that I think needs to be continued. We mustn't get complacent. We mustn't get into a position that we believe, we do the training, and so therefore it's enough. It has to be a continuous developmental process of training people, interviewing these people and assessing these people fully. We don't just want somebody who comes down to a stadium who wants actually to just see the game for free, and he puts a tabard on and he becomes a steward and he stands there. That is not
a volunteer policeman or auxiliary police officer.
Yeah, you need somebody. Many stewards historically were long-time supporters of the club, and they were doing, people give them a favour. There's a jacket, you just be there as a steward, open that door for us type thing if needs be, and just let it go, and so on and so forth. And then when things did go wrong, they weren't trained in dealing with it. The modern stadium now needs to have its own first aid facilities. It needs to have its own fire officers to an extent. It needs to have crowd stewards. It needs to have people trained in trauma, in dealing with trauma. It needs to have people who are alert and who are aware of the complexities of a crowd. It needs to have people who will see where something is going wrong before it gets to critical mass, before it gets to a point where it starts to fail. People who have the authority and the intelligence and the reactions to deal with human beings, to their fellow human beings, in a very positive manner, and not just go in and have a negative approach.
At management school, getting an MBA, or at police college.
Yeah.
Where do you get it? In the psychology department of a university, or where?
In the UK, with the United Kingdom, then there are training packages being developed by the Football Association and the Football League. However, fortunately, I'd say that since the Hillsborough disaster, most of the safety officers within the Football Association, at least in the Premiership in the UK, see this as just a basic starting point. A basic starting point, and they will use that. Although you'll be aware that within health and safety legislation, some people find if they fulfil the minimum requirements of a health and safety enactment, they feel as though they've done enough. That is quite dangerous. That's an assumption that health and safety enactment is accurate, is correct.
You mean the bylaws?
Yeah,
and
the bylaw. Yeah, bylaws. People hit. They say, I have done what the law says, therefore I don't have to do enough. Now, that fortunately, I'm pleased to say that within most of the largest stadia in the UK, the state safety officers take the training package that's provided by the governing bodies of football, and they develop it. They use that as a basis, and they develop it further to try and increase the humanistic response of their stewards towards their crowds. And so it isn't a confrontational. What you need to avoid these days is a confrontational approach between authority and crowd. That was the problem historically. That was one of our problems historically.
What are the main differences that you've found between UK and North American stadia?
With my limited knowledge of the North American stadia, what I've discovered is that in the UK we have what we class as a safety advisory group, which is made up of members of the local authority, members of the emergency services, and the people, and it liaises direct with the interested participants, the safety managers and the management of the stadium in general. Here it would appear that my understanding is that once a stadium is constructed using health and safety legislation, and it's created to that standard, then it no longer needs a license. That is it. It exists, and as long as the fire brigade say it remains safe, then events can take place. In the UK, it is necessary for each arena to be issued with a safety certificate at the commencement of each year or each soccer season.
Is that annual certificate of safety?
Yeah.
Does that uncover things? Is it just a rubber stamp?
Oh no, it's not. This was the problem. This was another problem. If we go back to the Hillsborough disaster, that the rubber stamp, that stadium had been given a rubber stamp for a few seasons. Owing to that, there's now quite a dynamic approach to the licensing of stadium, and the local safety advisory group are overseen by the Football Licensing Authority in the UK to ensure that the safety advisory groups are fulfilling their obligatory requirements. And so it can't be seen as rubber stamp, and there's a definite interest for all bodies involved, the emergency services and the local authorities and the stadium management, to ensure that isn't the case. It doesn't become a rubber stamp. There's a need for stadium managers never to become complacent about their safety certificate. They must not become complacent.
What are the most important two or three lessons that you think someone involved in the management of a stadium should learn from your studies of the past 100 years of stadium incidents?
Right. What they could learn. Never be totally reliant on structure. You must not be totally reliant on the physical structure of the stadium, because what you believe may be, have a tolerance that can hold a crowd back or whatever, may fail on you at the worst possible moment, which is always when it occurs. It always fails at the worst possible moment. Everything goes wrong the first time. Don't work to the minimum standards of health and safety legislation. You must always go beyond that. You must develop it. It's got to be a continual, proactive approach, dynamic, where you're working with your stewards, you're training, you're making your training interesting and varied, and you're getting feedback from them. It's a two-way thing. It must be a two-way thing in relation to training. This is very important. There is no point in training stewards and saying, you will stand there and you will do this, you will do that and do the other, because your steward is a person who is working a particular part of the stadium game after game, week after week, and they may see a problem, and if they haven't got the facility to give you that problem, then that problem could incubate into a massive disaster, because you need to have this two-way risk communication between the two parties involved. So there's a need for it to be dynamic. There's a need to have the right people as stewards who will respond to training and will take responsibility, feel they can talk back to you and make it work.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you very much.
Any views expressed here are not necessarily those of the Mackenzie Institute, its speakers, sponsors, or supporters. But the Institute is dedicated to fostering public discussion, debate, and education about security matters. Google the Mackenzie Institute to join the discussion. The Mackenzie Institute is grateful to its sponsors and supporters. Some of our short pods and long talks are a result of the support of Heathbridge Capital Management Limited, the National Post, and Dundurn Publishing.